The soldiers first thought the horizon was on fire. At 2:17 a.m., the dark Atlantic sky suddenly glowed crimson, reflecting across the restless waves like molten steel. Radar operators froze. Command posts erupted in confusion. No one had expected an attack. Not here, not tonight, and certainly not on American soil. Within minutes, history began moving faster than any man alive could understand, and a small group of ordinary soldiers would soon find themselves standing between disaster and survival. Chapter 1: The Warning That Almost No One Heard. Private Daniel Mercer never planned to become a war hero. He had grown up in a quiet coastal town where the loudest sounds were fishing boats and summer storms. War, to him, had always been something distant. Stories told by old veterans at parades, photographs in dusty textbooks, names carved into cold stone memorials. That illusion ended on a freezing November night. Daniel was stationed at a remote coastal defense base, one of dozens scattered along the shoreline. The base wasn't considered important. Most of the advanced equipment had been sent overseas where the fighting was intense, leaving only aging radar towers, outdated communication systems, and a skeleton crew of soldiers tasked with routine monitoring. It was supposed to be an easy assignment. At 1:52 a.m., Daniel sat inside the radar control room sipping bitter coffee while the rotating scanner hummed overhead. The screen displayed the usual scattered dots: commercial ships, weather patterns, occasional aircraft far out over the ocean. Nothing unusual. Until the static began. At first, it looked like interference, faint distortions crawling across the radar display. Daniel leaned closer, adjusting the signal filters. The distortions didn't disappear. Instead, they grew sharper, forming several small blips moving rapidly toward the coastline. He frowned. "Probably a glitch," said Sergeant Harlan without looking up from his paperwork. "That system's older than both of us." Daniel wasn't convinced. The blips were moving too steadily to be random noise. He recalibrated the system again, then checked the secondary scanner. The same pattern appeared. Fast, coordinated, approaching. "Sergeant," Daniel said quietly, "I think we've got incoming traffic." Harlan finally looked up. "Scheduled?" "No, sir." The sergeant walked over, studied the screen, and shrugged. "Could be fishing vessels." Daniel shook his head. "They're moving too fast." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the emergency alarm chirped once, an automatic system detecting unusual radar velocity. Harlan's expression changed. "Call it in," he ordered. Daniel reached for the communication headset, sending the radar data to regional command. The line crackled as the operator on the other end requested confirmation. Daniel repeated the coordinates twice, his voice tightening slightly as the blips drew closer. Minutes passed. No response. The command center, overwhelmed with reports from multiple locations along the coast, had not yet realized that several small radar stations were seeing the same thing. Daniel watched the screen as the unknown contacts split into groups. That was when the first explosion shook the harbor 20 miles north. The distant flash lit the sky faintly, even from their position, followed seconds later by a low rolling thunder that vibrated through the building's metal walls. Harlan stared toward the window. That wasn't training. The emergency alarm began wailing across the base. Chapter 2: Confusion Before Dawn. Within 10 minutes, the once sleepy installation transformed into organized chaos. Soldiers rushed across the compound, pulling on helmets and gear, half awake but moving fast. Officers shouted orders that changed every few seconds as new information arrived. No one knew the full situation. Reports came in fragments: unidentified aircraft spotted offshore, explosions near multiple coastal facilities, communication outages in 2 nearby ports, several radar towers going offline. Daniel helped relay incoming transmissions while technicians tried desperately to maintain unstable communication links. Static dominated most channels, punctuated by urgent voices shouting coordinates, damage assessments, and requests for air support. Command says remain on defensive readiness, Harlan announced. No confirmed invasion yet. Daniel glanced back at the radar display. The unknown contacts had not retreated. They were still coming. A young lieutenant rushed into the control room. We've got visual confirmation from Harbor Station 3. Unmarked aircraft flying low over the water. Identification unknown. How many? Asked Harlan. Too many. Outside, the deep roar of engines began echoing across the coastline. Daniel stepped out briefly, staring toward the dark ocean. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then, faint shapes appeared, tiny silhouettes skimming the horizon, almost invisible against the night sky. Searchlights suddenly activated, slicing long beams across the darkness. The shapes became unmistakable. Aircraft, dozens of them, and they were heading directly toward the mainland.
Chapter 3. The First Defense. Anti-aircraft batteries positioned along the coast powered on with mechanical thunder. The crews had trained for years, but had never fired at real enemy targets approaching the homeland. Hands trembled slightly as shells were loaded and targeting systems calibrated. Daniel had never heard the guns in combat before. The first cannon fired at 2:26 a.m. The blast punched the air so hard it felt like the sky itself had cracked open. Seconds later, dozens more guns joined in, creating a rolling chain of explosions that echoed for miles. Bright tracer rounds streaked upward, forming glowing arcs across the sky. Some aircraft changed course immediately, breaking formation to avoid the barrage. Others continued forward, maintaining a frighteningly disciplined advance. The base loudspeakers crackled. "All personnel, this is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill." Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him. Fear existed, but it was distant, pushed aside by the simple need to follow orders. Sergeant Harlan handed him a field radio. "You're with the emergency relay team. If communications drop, runners carry the messages manually. Stay close." Daniel nodded. Overhead, the sound of engines grew deafening. Then came the second wave of explosions, this time much closer. Chapter 4. The Battle No One Expected. The first bomb struck an empty storage yard near the harbor, sending massive columns of smoke spiraling into the night sky. Emergency vehicles sped toward the impact sites, while anti-aircraft crews intensified their fire. One aircraft suddenly burst into flames after being hit, spiraling downward before disappearing beyond the hills. A cheer rose briefly among the soldiers, quickly replaced by grim focus as more enemy planes pressed forward. Daniel helped transmit updated coordinates between defense units. Communication lines flickered constantly, forcing teams to switch between radios, backup systems, and even signal flares in some sectors. Despite the confusion, something remarkable began happening. Local defense teams, many of them under-equipped and underestimated, started coordinating with surprising efficiency. Radar technicians, harbor patrols, and air defense crews shared real-time information, gradually forming a defensive network that slowed the attackers' advance. The enemy had expected surprise. They had not expected resistance this fast. At 3:05 a.m., the 1st American Fighter Squadron scrambled from a nearby airfield, roaring into the dark sky like thunder breaking through a storm. For the soldiers on the ground, the sight brought something they desperately needed: hope. Daniel watched the fighters climb, their navigation lights blinking faintly before vanishing into the smoke-filled night. Somewhere above the clouds, the first aerial dogfights of the battle were already beginning. And no one yet knew that what had started as a sudden attack would soon evolve into one of the most astonishing military turning points in modern American history. Chapter 5. Fire over the coast. The first American fighter jets reached the incoming aircraft formation at 3:12 a.m. From the ground, Daniel could only see distant flashes, tiny bursts of light scattered across the dark sky like sudden stars being born and dying within seconds. But the radio channels told a much louder story. Pilots shouting coordinates, warning of enemy maneuvers, reporting hits, calling for reinforcements. Bandits confirmed hostile. Repeat, hostile aircraft confirmed. The words spread through the defense network like electricity. Until that moment, some officers still believed the situation might be a misidentification or an accidental incursion. That doubt vanished instantly. This was a coordinated attack, and it had been planned carefully. Sergeant Harlan handed Daniel another set of transmission sheets. Command wants continuous updates every 3 minutes, no delays. Daniel nodded, relaying the latest radar plots to regional command, while technicians adjusted tracking systems to compensate for electronic interference that had begun flooding the frequencies. Someone, somewhere, was trying to blind their detection network. Yet the old radar towers, dismissed for years as outdated equipment, possessed one unexpected advantage. They were too simple to be easily disabled by modern electronic warfare. Their signals remained faint, but stubbornly operational, providing critical tracking data that newer digital systems temporarily struggled to maintain. It was an accidental advantage, one that would soon prove decisive. Outside, the thunder of anti-aircraft guns never stopped.
Chapter 6: The Harbor That Refused to Fall.
Reports began arriving from the northern harbor where the first explosions had occurred. Several storage depots were damaged and one cargo ship had been struck, but the port remained operational. Emergency crews had moved faster than anyone expected, containing fires before they could spread to fuel reserves that would have triggered catastrophic destruction. Daniel listened to the transmissions with growing amazement. Civilians, dock workers, and off-duty personnel had joined firefighters and naval teams to move supplies, clear debris, and guide ships out of vulnerable zones. The harbor, initially believed to be an easy target, was still functioning. "Who's coordinating up there?" Daniel asked. "No one," Harlan replied. "Everyone." Another message arrived seconds later. "Harbor defenses requesting additional air cover, multiple low-altitude attackers approaching." Daniel transmitted the request. Within minutes, 2 fighter units redirected toward the harbor sector. For the first time since the attack began, the defense response felt organized rather than reactive. The enemy had expected confusion. Instead, they were encountering determination.
The plan behind the attack. At Regional Command Headquarters, intelligence officers were piecing together a troubling picture. The attack had not focused on major cities, but on radar stations, fuel depots, and coastal communication centers, targets designed to weaken defensive coordination rather than cause immediate mass casualties. It suggested a larger objective. If the coastal network collapsed, follow-up operations could strike deeper inland with far less resistance. But something had gone wrong for the attackers. Several targeted radar towers remained active. Emergency communication teams had improvised backup systems faster than expected, and civilian response units had prevented secondary disasters at key infrastructure points. The carefully designed opening strike was losing momentum, and the longer the defenders held, the more reinforcements would arrive. The longest hour. Between 3:30 and 4:30 a.m., the battle reached its most intense phase. Enemy aircraft made repeated attempts to disable anti-aircraft batteries, diving through heavy defensive fire to release precision strikes. Several defense installations were damaged, but few were completely destroyed. Crews relocated guns, switched to mobile launchers, and continued firing even from partially destroyed positions. Daniel found himself carrying message packets across the base when radio channels temporarily jammed. The cold night air smelled of smoke and burning metal, and the ground vibrated with distant impacts. Searchlights still swept the sky, occasionally locking on to aircraft silhouettes before artillery bursts forced them away. At one point, an explosion knocked out power to a section of the compound, plunging half the base into darkness. Backup generators roared to life less than a minute later, restoring operations before attackers could exploit the blackout. "Feels like the whole coast is fighting," one soldier muttered as Daniel passed. In many ways, it was. turning the tide. Shortly before dawn, additional fighter squadrons arrived from inland air bases. Their presence changed the balance almost immediately. Instead of intercepting attackers near the shoreline, American aircraft began pushing the battle farther out over the ocean, forcing enemy formations to fight at longer distances from their intended targets. Radar operators reported something new. Several hostile aircraft were retreating earlier than expected, abandoning attack runs halfway through their approach. Fuel limitations, growing losses, and stronger than anticipated resistance were beginning to reshape the attacker's strategy. At 5:07 a.m., Command issued the first cautiously optimistic message: "Coastal defense lines holding. Repeat, defense lines holding." The announcement spread rapidly through communication channels, lifting morale across every installation still engaged in the fight. Daniel heard it over the radio and felt a surge of energy despite exhaustion. Hours earlier, the situation had felt uncertain, even desperate. Now, for the first time, victory seemed possible.
Dawn reveals the battlefield. As the first light of sunrise crept across the Atlantic, the scale of the conflict finally became visible. Smoke columns rose from scattered impact sites along the shoreline. Naval patrol ships maneuvered through the harbor, assisting damaged vessels. Emergency helicopters transported injured personnel, while engineering teams inspected runways and infrastructure for rapid repairs. But the most striking sight was above the ocean. Far out on the horizon, the last groups of attacking aircraft were withdrawing, chased by American fighters that remained on patrol to ensure the retreat continued. The immediate danger had not completely ended, yet the opening assault had clearly failed to achieve its main objective. The defenders had held. Daniel stood outside the communications building, watching the sunrise, the sky still faintly tinted red from lingering smoke. Only hours earlier, that same sky had glowed with explosions and tracer fire. Now it looked almost peaceful, as if the night's violence had been some strange illusion. Sergeant Harlan stepped beside him. "You realize something, Mercer?" "What's that, sir?" "We just witnessed the start of something historians are going to talk about for a long time." Daniel looked toward the ocean again. He didn't know it yet, but the events of this single night, an attack expected to cripple coastal defenses, would instead trigger one of the most remarkable defensive mobilizations in modern American military history. And for the small group of soldiers stationed at that overlooked coastal base, the most dangerous days were still ahead. After the silence. By mid-morning, the guns finally stopped. The sudden quiet felt almost unnatural after hours of continuous explosions. Soldiers who had been shouting over artillery blasts now spoke in low voices, as if afraid loud sounds might restart the battle. Medical teams moved quickly between temporary treatment stations, while engineering crews inspected damaged equipment. Daniel had not slept in nearly 20 hours, yet exhaustion had not fully reached him. Adrenaline still flowed through his system, keeping his mind alert as he helped log communication transcripts from the night's events. Every transmission mattered. Intelligence officers needed precise timelines to understand how the attack had unfolded. Preliminary reports confirmed what many had already suspected. The attack had been large, coordinated, and intended to cripple coastal defenses before a second, larger operation could begin. But that plan had failed. The unexpected speed of local response, combined with the survival of several radar stations, had disrupted the attackers' timing. Reinforcements had reached interception points minutes earlier than enemy planners expected, just enough to prevent deeper penetration inland. Command issued a classified assessment. Primary objective of initial attack not achieved. For the defenders, the realization carried quiet satisfaction. Equipment many had complained about for years had become the very reason the coastline remained protected. The volunteers. That afternoon, something remarkable began happening across nearby towns and cities. Civilian volunteers arrived at coastal bases offering help: mechanics, truck drivers, construction workers, radio operators, even retired veterans who had once served in earlier conflicts. Many had heard the distant explosions during the night and refused to remain at home while soldiers struggled to repair damaged infrastructure. Temporary coordination centers were established to organize the influx of assistance. Volunteers helped unload supplies, reinforce defensive positions, and transport equipment between installations. Some assisted communication units by running physical message lines between stations whenever electronic interference disrupted radio transmissions. Daniel watched as a convoy of civilian trucks delivered replacement generator components that engineers had been waiting for since morning. "They showed up before the official supply chain did," Sergeant Harlan said, shaking his head in amazement. It was not part of any official mobilization order. It was simply people deciding to help. The intelligence breakthrough. Late that evening, intelligence analysts reviewing intercepted signals made a discovery that changed everything. The attackers had expected multiple radar networks along the coast to go offline simultaneously, creating a gap large enough for additional strike waves to enter undetected. Instead, several small installations, considered outdated and strategically insignificant, had remained operational, continuing to transmit tracking data throughout the night. Those small stations, including Daniel Space, had unknowingly preserved the defensive grid. Because the network never fully collapsed, reinforcements had been directed precisely where they were needed most. Fighter squadrons had reached interception points minutes earlier than enemy planners expected, just enough to prevent deeper penetration inland. Command issued a classified assessment. Primary objective of initial attack not achieved. For the defenders, the realization carried quiet satisfaction. Equipment many had complained about for years had become the very reason the coastline remained protected.